we use in the labor movement at all. But some of the best parts for me go, they have taken untold millions that they never told to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel would turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. Now, if you just look at those words, I mean, there's great power. And the brother yesterday from Ireland who read the poem by Yeats, Ralph Chapin wasn't as eloquent at Yeats, but he brings the point home that without workers, not a single wheel would turn. The country would not operate. But the problem is that in our country, we devalue the value of labor, but immeasurably, and we devalue the centrality that the trade union movement should have in a progressive democracy in our country. And I think we do that to our peril. The power that the labor movement has and the power that workers have in this country to build democracy is an essential part of the work that we all ought to be doing. But the centrality of workers has been lost in our country, even in some of the progressive sections of our movement. It's been lost, and people have forgotten what it was that the labor movement represents and the power that workers have to substantially change the economic relationship between us and capital and the world. And that's one of the reasons many of us got involved in the labor movement, because we know intuitively that it's amongst the working class is to where the real power lies and how we can substantively change the relationship of forces in our country.
Yeah. Joseph, do you want to add on to that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the labor movement has been attacked for nearly 40 years, right? There's been an all-out attack by the corporate class to destroy worker power. And that's significant because that power of workers is the only thing that stands between our democracy and having a completely corporate-run government. And I think there's a straight line between the current political moment and the fact that all three branches of government are bought and owned by the corporate class. I think that's a direct result of both a Republican assault on workers and Democratic complicity, right? That has created a moment where the working class has been eviscerated and we don't have a powerful countervailing force to take on capital. And I think if we are to win the vision that all of us share, right? We want to expand civil rights. We want to expand healthcare access. We want to create a clean environment. I would argue that the conditions precedent for that are empowering the working class to take on the corporate class. The truth is, we as a society did accomplish many of these things. In the 50s, in the 60s, right, we closed the gap between the rich and the poor. We expanded health care, right? We launched a war on poverty. And part of the reason we were able to do that is because we had a strong and powerful labor movement. In the 50s and 60s, nearly 35%, I had a slide, I don't know if it's going to come up, but nearly 35% of private sector workers were in unions, right? That was the height of union power, and it was a progressive moment in our country, right, where we were able to move an agenda that improved the lives of every American. But since then, right, there's been a sharp decline in union density, and now less than 6% of private sector workers are in unions. And the challenge for all of us, if we are to realize the vision that the Sanders Institute is giving us space to articulate, if we are to realize that vision, I think it is imperative that we do everything possible to increase the number of workers in unions. And the final thing I want to say is I think, you know, just on the topic of labor being essential to democracy, I think the Republican Party understands that much more so than our allies, perhaps on the Democratic Party. The first thing that Republican elected officials do when they get into office is to use the power of government to suppress worker rights. Scott Walker in Wisconsin, Rick Schneider in Michigan, right to work, eviscerating collective bargaining rights for public sector employees, right? Those actions helped deliver Michigan and Wisconsin to Donald Trump, right? And is helping move that agenda. The problem on our side is when we elect Democrats or mainstream Democrats, right? Their goal is not to immediately grow the labor movement, right? But it should be. It fundamentally should be. That is who we are, right? We want to make sure that every man, woman, and child has an opportunity to live a full and abundant life, and part of that is, right, having material sustenance. But Democrats don't make it their first order of business. That being said, I want to just point out there is a path to rebuild the labor movement, and Franklin Roosevelt laid that out. And it was not an easy path, but it was a path that arose because workers at the turn of the century, at the emergence of a new economy, a new industrial economy that was dominated by the corporate class, workers took risks. Workers in the steel industry and the auto industry, they went out on strike. And they forced the president to champion labor law reform. The passage of the Wagner Act in 1935 led to a surge of 3 million new workers in unions, right? We need labor law reform. But even more significantly, President Roosevelt used his executive power. Not only did he use the power of the bully pulpit to move Congress to pass labor law reform, he used his executive powers. He said, if you want to do business with the United States government, you have to have a collective bargaining relationship. He signed that executive order in 1941, and with that stroke of the pen, President Roosevelt put 10 million workers into unions, right? It was a combination of both legislative action and executive action. And if we are to create the progressive moment that we're all committed to building, right, it's incumbent on us to continue to organize workers, to stand with workers who are on the picket lines, and make sure the next president puts forward a vision, right, of growing the labor movement as one of their first orders of business.
Thank you. Thank you. That means we should probably put forward a president who's going to do that. What do you think, Mark?
Is that a setup or what?
Isn't it always?
Before I get into answering the question,
You don't need answers.
I just want to say good morning.
Morning.
And thank the Institute for the invitation. I don't know if the nurses are still here. I got a confession to make. My mother was not a nurse.
That's so funny.
But speaking of my mother, I do want to say this. She is a young woman who grew up in New York City, the home of a powerful and organized left-wing movement and militant workers movement. And she went to college for free. So when the Bernie Sanders campaign raised up these kind of issues, that uplifted workers, that we deserved better and we deserve more. And people said it's impossible. Tell it to my mother and the tens of thousands and millions of people like her that had an opportunity because the movement had built these kind of rights, human rights, right into their very lives. So I think that story, and probably many of you know people that had that kind of public opportunity based on being built by the movement. Would I like politicians and legislators and presidents to support the labor movement? Was that the question?
No, that was the setup.
Oh, that was the setup. So what was the question? I mean, I'm happy.
Well, actually, I have a lot of questions for you, but what I'm excited about you talking about, in addition to what you want to talk about, is the work that you're doing in terms of bringing banks into the post offices. I think that is some of the best work that's going on in the country.
So, under our topic of the labor movement essential for democracy, I think that it's very, very important for the labor movement to be fighting, especially unions that represent public sector workers, but not solely, certainly, to be fighting for the public good. That's what the nurses are doing when they're fighting through their union for Medicare for all.
Right.
It ties in the rights and the benefits and the opportunities to do their jobs, and it ties into the needs of the community to have health care as a human right. So one is, I think, if the labor movement is going to be true to this topic, then we have to be defenders of the public good. And brothers and sisters, let me divert just a minute. It's not automatic that the labor movement is on the side of democracy. It's not automatic. We have a history in this country. We have unions that divided the workers and practiced segregation within their own unions. That's not essential to democracy. We had a labor movement that generally sided with Cold War foreign policies that divided workers here from workers around the world and broke international solidarity. And then we had great examples the other way. This is the 50th anniversary of the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, the historic strike. 1,300 African-American men, basically in the segregated South, with no voice and no rights at work, took on the powers that be, united labor and civil rights, economic and social justice, and won. That's a wonderful example of the labor movement, essential to democracy. Nearby me, where I lived the last 33 years before I moved to the seat of the empire when I got elected and had to move to D.C. I lived in Greensboro, North Carolina. Down the road in Winston-Salem, 1940s, R.J. Reynolds, food, tobacco, and agricultural workers. In the segregated South, with a union largely made up of African-American workers, but not solely, organized voter registration and voter rights and elected the first African-American state representative in the history of the South since Reconstruction. That was led by the union. That's a union essential for democracy. And I would submit that what the teachers and the school workers just did in West Virginia and beyond was part of the fight for democracy as well. And there are many, many other examples, but it's not automatic. It depends whether our unions, whether the workers control the union, whether the workers are involved, and whether the leaders are accountable to the people. But back to what we're doing with postal banking and some other things. So part of the public, we look at the post office. And many of you here do, I know, as a democratic right of the people. The right to have equal access to this exchange of information, to communication, no matter who we are or where we live. 157 million addresses every day. And so the post office itself is part of democracy to the extent that we have it. And within that, there are many things that the post office can and should be doing. Post office is under severe attack. The public post office is under severe attack. It didn't start with this administration. It's not going to end with this administration like so many of other problems, but it is getting worse. And so we have a White House OMB report, Office of Management Budget, calling for actually selling the post office to private corporations for private profit. And there goes universal service, and there would go our democratic rights. And I have to call out our good Senator Bernie Sanders for being one of the most ferocious fighters to defend the public post office. He's not alone. But within the attack, we want to talk about opportunity and uniting with the public good. Even in our negotiations with management, we raise some of these things. And one of the main things we're working on with the other postal unions, not just us, with the Grand Alliance to Save the Public Postal Service, of which Brother Danny Glover is our main public face.
Nice.
We have raised up two really proactive issues around democracy. And the main one is postal banking. Now, many of you may not know that there used to be a postal bank in this country for 66 years. And if you talk to some people that are older than me, and I'm on the older side myself, you'll find people that actually banked at the Postal Service. Many countries around the world, the post office provides postal banking. Now, why not have a public option for banking? There's a huge social problem, or I should say in this setting, a huge social problem. Close to 80 million people don't have access to basic banking. That includes people throughout rural America where the banks have left. It includes many immigrant workers. It includes many inner city and urban people. It includes many single mothers. It includes veterans coming out of the military. And they get stuck in the predatory payday lending, legal loan sharking, check cashing industry, where low-paid, hard-working folks have to pay 10 or 20 bucks of their paycheck just to get it cashed, and constantly get stuck in this cycle of peonage. And the banks are behind this. This money just, you know, the politicians are behind this big time. This is a huge industry. And just imagine if in every post office in the country, 35,000 post offices, people could at least begin to take advantage of basic financial services without getting ripped off, and have it provided by the public, by accountable, trusted postal workers. You know, the institution itself is the most trusted institution in the country, over and over and over. So what a great opportunity this would be. It's not going to happen by magic. We're not even trying at this point to legislate it. We're trying to force the post office through a bottom-up demand in certain parts of the country to try to open some pilot programs and to provide some basic service. I don't know if the New York City mayor is in the room today or not, or is he? I can't see from here. All right, we're trying to. We have a grassroots movement in the Bronx to demand financial services. We've raised with the post office. Think about this: Puerto Rico, the devastation, the lack of support from this government following the hurricanes and all that. Let's put financial services into every post office in Puerto Rico to provide support for the people there to rebuild and so on and so forth. These are the kind of things that the post office will say, we're not interested. But if the people are interested, we think that we can force the post office to do it. So those are some of the things. The other quick proactive thing, we're fighting for vote by mail everywhere. Yes. And, you know, some people may say, well, that's selfish. You're the president of the American Postal Workers Union. You just want more letters in the mail. Well, we welcome more letters in the mail. But the reality is, and again, many of us are speaking to the choir, voter suppression is so deep that just in D.C., the last two elections that I voted in, I went to the polling place and couldn't vote because the lines were so long. So I went to work. I happened to know the boss very well. So I talked to the president of the union, got in front of the mirror, and I left when my wife said the lines were short a few hours later. How many working people can do that? just the fact that Election Day is on a work day rather than a non-work day. Vote by mail will not solve all the voter suppression issues, the felony questions, some of the ID questions, all that, but it does solve the question of access to the voting booth, how many voting stations there are, how many opportunities there are to vote in those stations, the long lines, long hours of work and polling. I mean, if you work from 7 to 7, you ain't voting.
Right.
And they don't want, the powers that be do not want working people and oppressed people to vote, period. That was how the country was founded, and that's how a lot of people would like to get it back to. But the vote, the question of the right to vote is a precious democratic right, won through blood, sweat, and tears. And vote by mail will help enhance it. And the states that use it, like Oregon, they have the best results. They have, you know, there's no proven fraud. If a letter gets lost here and there, gets eaten up by a machine, it could happen. So let's say one ballot gets lost, but 100,000 people couldn't vote because the lines were too long and it's a work day. So the mail is very secure, and guess what else it does? You got a paper trail of everything, don't you? So those are some of the fight around the labor movement being essential for democracy. I'm sorry it went on so long. I ripped up my 2-hour speech. That was just me.
I'm amazed at your discipline here, really. But he called out Danny Glover in terms of your work, helping with the postal struggles. Danny, and of course,
and the fight for 15.
And the fight for 15, and everything I've ever been involved with in my life, I think. Thank you, Danny, for the lifetime of commitment. And then also Senator Sanders, who's hiding from us. But
oh, I thought he left when I started speaking.
Sure.
So let me, first, I mean, I was remiss because Roseanne made me sing a song in terms of being polite and respectful to our hosts. And I really want to appreciate the Sanders Institute and the work that you all are doing and inviting us all and bringing us all together. It's really, we really appreciate it very much, and to be able to be invited and be a part of this has really been a pleasure and an honor for us. So I really appreciate that. And then I just want to give a shout out, and I sort of figure we have a right to do it in our union. We've been supporting Medicare single payer for everybody since the 1943 Murray Wagner Dingell Act. So we go back a while on that. And we've been through various iterations of it for over the last 60 years for quite a while. But we're really appreciative and grateful of the leadership role that the NNU, National Nurses United, has been playing on this effort in the most recent iteration of it. And in particular, the leadership that is expressed by Roseanne DeMauro and the new executive director of the NNU, Bonnie Castillo, who is a long friend and comrade. The work that they've been doing, NNU, on this issue. And also, people don't know this, on the rapid response work that the NNU does when there's a disaster is really some pretty good examples of the kind of work that a progressive trade union movement can do. Instead of just giving money to a place that is undergoing a disaster, they actually send help and physical resources and provide real sustenance and energy and support for folks. And then finally, I just also want to say that we really appreciate the work that Senator Sanders has done, not only in Vermont for the last number of decades. And our union has had a long history in Vermont. We've known Senator Sanders since he was mayor of Burlington and before. We used to have 7,000 machine tool workers in the state of Vermont. We have one factory left of 75 people. That's about an hour and a half east of here in St. Johnsbury. But we've transformed our membership from cutting tool workers to nonprofit workers, to public sector workers, and then right up the street there's an immigrant document center that we represent up in northern Vermont. So we've had a long history in the state, a really long, proud history state, and we really appreciate the work that Senator Sanders did on behalf of workers in the state of Vermont. But not only that, during his presidential campaign, from my perspective, it was not just a presidential campaign, it was a literacy campaign. It was an economic literacy campaign. And he gave the whole country an amazing lesson on the economics and how things work. And for us, that value and what it has brought to this country is really pretty substantial. And what he's done, one of the things that Bernie so eloquently gave to all of us who are not in the trade union movement, who may not work in a factory, is the role and the central role that unions play. It really is quite incredible for me when we spend half of our waking lives in a factory, in a workplace, because one of the third we're sleeping, theoretically, and yet it is in an anti-democratic, authoritarian environment completely. You know, when 93% of the private sector workers work in a non-union setting, that means 93% of that population is going to work in a dictatorship every day. And it is long known in the union movement, all those of us who work in the union know when we first started, democracy stops at the door. And it is an accepted fact in this country that when you walk through a door into a workplace, you lose all the democratic rights that we have in the street. You lose your freedom of assembly. You use your freedom of speech. You use your freedom to redress and to file grievances. Now, theoretically, according to the labor law, Section 7 in particular, the Labor Act, you have the right to do that. But the practical reality is we don't. And I'm just going to give you one example of how that happens. But before I do that, I would be remiss if I did not recognize that December 10th is the 10th anniversary of the slogan, the banks get bailed out, workers get sold out. How many people here in this room know where that slogan came from? One person. Kelly knows. Is anybody else? Republic Windows and Doors. If folks remember, 10 years ago, this December 10th, there was an occupation of a window factory in Chicago, Illinois, UE Local 1110, where the employer was going to shut down the facility and they weren't going to give anybody their 60-day severance or pay, which they're required to do by law. And they didn't, so the workers didn't know what to do, so they occupied the factory for a week. Didn't let anybody in, had amazing publicity around the country. Then President-elect Barack Obama actually said that he thought the workers in Chicago had a point and that they were on the right side. Now, he did not go down, I will mind you, despite the fact he said he would. He never went down there to support them. But that caught fire. And for many of us in our union, we actually think that was the progenitor to Wall Street and to the occupation of Wall Street. And banks got bailed out, we got sold out, and somewhat is a great framework of what exists and the problems that exist in this country. And the reason why that can happen, the reason why they have the ability to do that is because of the corporation's ability to stop workers from bringing basic democratic principles into the workplace. And here's how it's done. I want to say probably around 2012, I think it was around 2012. It was about a year or so after we settled the national contract negotiations with General Electric. We represent thousands of General Electric workers and have historically since our founding in '36. And it was a plant in Jacinto Port, Texas, just outside of Houston. They made derivatives called aerospace derivatives. You take a jet engine, you hook it up to a pipeline, and you put the gas or oil through that pipeline. 350 workers, mostly a Latino workforce. The tradition has been in General Electric is that after we settle the national negotiations, all of the non-union shops in General Electric get everything that we settled for. But because of what's happened to the labor movement and the weaknesses that are in the labor movement, and General Electric usually feels its oats, they figured that for this year, in 2012, they weren't going to give everybody all of the raises and the increases that we did in that contract. So they didn't to most of the non-union facilities. In addition, they had told this predominantly Latinx workforce that they could no longer speak Spanish on the shop floor. We got a call from that workforce, 350 workers. We got a call from them. Within 3 weeks, 70% of that workforce signed union cards. 70%, 350 people. Yeah, you're clapping way too early. I haven't finished the story yet. So then in our country, when workers petition for an election to the labor board, you don't get an election right away. In Canada, you get an election within 5 days. In our country, the average used to be 11 weeks. Now it's around 6 weeks, a month to 6 weeks, that you get an election. What is the company doing during that period of time? They send people into the shop and they brutally bully, harass, verbally abuse workers. Has anybody experienced this? Anybody in this room have ever been through a union organizing campaign before in the private sector? So if you do, you know what it's about. You understand intuitively unfortunately, most people in this country don't understand what happens. So General Electric sent 50 to 75 managers from around the country, brought them into Jacinto-Port, put them up in a hotel, hired school buses, and every day for 2 solid weeks, those managers walked the floor and had one-on-one discussions with people, had captive audiences, meetings with people, and did the things like, although it's illegal for a company to say, if you organize a union, we're going to shut it down, guess what those one-on-one conversations involve? That's all that involves. It's all about giving them the idea, if they do this, here's what we're going to do. When we had the election, we lost by 70-30. We lost by 70-30. Now, if workers had the ability to freely express their opinion, their feelings about organizing in their workplace, that vote would have been 70-30 in support of the union. But because we give the company the ability to beat us up in the workplace, you no longer have any freedom of will. When your employer who has that kind of standing over you, you no longer have that freedom of will. And it is one of the problems that exists in this country when it comes to labor law. It is one of the things that Taft-Hartley put into place. One of the things, people don't know this, that from 1935 to 1947 when Taft-Hartley was passed, the labor movement tripled in size from 5 million people to 15 million workers. From 1947 until today, it has essentially remained flat, around 14.8, 15 million workers. And the reason why it's remained flat is because workers don't have any democracy in the workplace until you get a union. And then you get a measure of democracy depending upon how strong people are. But this fact that the ability of the employer to interfere in the decision of a group of workers from our union's perspective is just wrong and is completely undemocratic. And it's one of the things that until we are able to free up people's ability to freely express their decisions in that workplace. And I'm not talking about holding a debating society at work. I'm not talking about giving workers the ability to run the factory, although in many respects we would do it better than General Electric does, for instance. But I am talking about people having the freedom to be able to decide that, yes, I want a voice. Yes, I want my organization to be able to represent us at the workplace and be able to sit down with the employer. We actually believe, we don't think the employer has any role in that process at all, should have any voice in that process at all, and that it should be completely left up to the workers to decide whether or not they want to have an organization. But until we're able to do that, and it needs to be a key plank of any political movement, until we're able to achieve that, workers will never able to be able to attain true democracy. And I would submit to everybody in this room and anybody listening that if you work half of your life in a dictatorship, how does that not spill over into our broader community, into the collective psyche of the United States? And it's a really critical issue. We don't talk about it enough. But I think this issue of the lack of democracy that we have in the workplace is one of the reasons why we're in the pickle we are in this country right now.
No, I mean, each one of these, I mean, we could all go on. I mean, like literally, I mean, this is us constrained. That's what's, yeah, it really is, actually. I mean, I think that probably, you know, the work that I've done in my life in the labor movement is some of the work that I'm the most proud of in my life. I mean, one of the things I would say in terms of growing the nurses union that was extremely, you know, I think, and it wasn't cutting edge. The great Tony Mazzocchi, who was in the United Oil and Chemical Workers years ago, taught this to me. He and Ralph Nader actually, when I was kind of a young organizer, they got me in their clutches. And this is why it's really important to have mentors, and taught me you have to introduce culture, education into a union. You can't just have it, you know, it's not just about what happens inside the factory in terms of fighting with the boss. It's their life. So you look at the life of the workers. So what we did in the nurses union, and actually tried to do in some of the other unions, but it didn't work out that well, is every time we had a meeting is to do a mobilization against, there's so many targets, right? I mean, there's like, you walk out a door, well, maybe not in Vermont, I will say this, it's kind of like peace and love downstairs and all that good stuff. I mean, like, wow. Our offices were in Oakland. They didn't have peace and love signs everywhere. But But there's always targets. So I mean, there's always targets. Wherever you travel in the United States, there's a target. There's a bank that's always doing something evil. I mean, all of the things that we articulated last night on the panel of all the different sectors in this economy that are harming people. You can protest. It's endless in America, all of the targets for protests, right? And they all tie into the human condition. And if you tie your workers into the human condition, and it's not just about my boss is messing me over and therefore, I'm going to strike, but how about let's take a stand for all of the people in this society. And when the labor movement connects with the public good, guess what? When you're out on strike, that public connects with you. And that's one of the things that I think that we did that was so profound. We grew the union on steroids. And we also did, which I think is, we did all these great initiatives. We lost a lot of things. We put on a ballot initiative in California for clean money. That was the most infamous thing I think that we lost because we lost so badly because the labor movement was against us. We did all of these different things, but one thing that we did do with the members, why they stayed so solid for so long, was we did political education, political economy, hardcore, and it was deep. It wasn't, we didn't act like our workers weren't capable of understanding. You got to put it on a flyer, we knew that they were capable of understanding and pitched it at a very high level, and you know what? They loved it. It is one, and Bernie always says this, one of the most successful things that we did. So I think, you have to believe in your members, and that's the thing. You have to believe ultimately that, Trump tricked them. Let's face it. He tripped them with Bernie's message in the campaign about the working class. So when we get into the next campaign, whatever that campaign is, we have got to mobilize. Working people are the most powerful force on earth, right? I mean, that's the most powerful force. You gather up, and we're all workers. That's the other thing. The labor movement isn't just who's in unions. It's all of us who work. It's all of us who work. So when we're listening to the things about, unions have become so delegitimized. When I look at kind of the brilliance of the people who are doing the work and the brilliance of workers and the struggles, getting up every day and fighting the conditions and just from the heart, I mean, just respecting labor is just such a critical thing for us all to understand and to get, that people are inherently good, but they get in these situations where they're beaten down, and we have got to lift them up. We've got to lift up all the workers in this country. So I just want to ask very quickly, we've got a limited amount of time, but do you think unions should be political, or do you think they should just focus on their shop floor? That's not a setup, but...
You want me to start?
Oh, sure.
Well, I think that the answer is that unions and the working class needs to be political as hell. We hear from when I was local president in Greensboro, people would say, well, why are you doing all that outside stuff? Well, you shouldn't be political. This is just about representing us with a grievance and all that stuff. And our answer always was, when we leave that workplace, we live in the communities. And people from the community work in the workplace. And what happens in the community affects our families. I mean, you can see it. We have postal workers who lost homes in Puerto Rico in the storm, lost homes in the fires. To our knowledge, no postal workers died, but plenty of people did. That's a connection, right? Flint water. Postal workers live in Flint and work in Flint. So, look, the last time I checked, the Koch brothers are political as hell.
Right.
Wall Street's political. The pharmaceuticals are political. And then people tell us, unions, workers, don't be political. Mm-hmm. So we have to be more political. And I have some views that, I think part of our problem as a working class is we are functioning right now and facing lesser of two evil duopoly. And I don't know any other way to put it. And it doesn't mean that there aren't good individuals who are really on the side of working people within the Democratic Party, and maybe even here and there within the Republican Party. But the institutions The political parties have failed, absolutely failed the working class. And I tell people, you know, when it comes to, you know, elect anybody with a D by their name and all this, let's take off our rose-colored glasses, right? It's the party of mass incarceration. It's the party of mass deportation. It's the party of wars of regime change. It's the parties of bloated military budgets. It's the party of enriching the pharmaceuticals instead of health care for all. Party of NAFTA. It's the party of NAFTA. And these rotten trade deals. And so we need a way out. And my feeling is, listen, if you don't know it, I'll tell you. The working class is done with the status quo and business as usual in this country. And they are rightfully done. Now, what direction it goes in, that's what's up for grabs. So what happened in the last election is what was the pundit said. It's going to be Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. Last time I checked, it's neither. And what I think in part drove the wonderful Sanders campaign, besides the aspirational message to the U.S. working class and uplifting people's standards, and you know, the idea that we're worth more, right? We're worth everything. But part of it was that people were done.
That's right.
And when that campaign was moved aside, we can debate in another forum the role of the DNC. Trump stepped into that void. But part of what drove the Sanders campaign to great heights of success, let's not forget that, also played into Trump's ascendancy. Because the working class is hurting, and they're done with business as usual. And I believe, and my union believes, and I'll tell you, I brought it because I am representing 200,000 people throughout the entire political spectrum of the United States, in every town, city, hamlet, and everything in between. And we've been grappling with this issue, as working people should. And in our 2016 August convention, 2,000 delegates, we passed a resolution called Exploring New Directions for Labor in Electoral Politics. And it resolved that in addition to the traditional supporting of electoral candidates who are friends and allies of postal workers, the American Postal Workers Union also pursue a strategy of advancing our core issues through referenda, initiatives, and propositions, study the viability of independent and third-party politics, and explore the possibility of creating a new labor-based political party. That's the view of our 2,000 delegates. Now, I don't think there's any easy way. My good friend, probably many of you consider him a good friend too, Larry Cohn, the chair of our revolution, former CWA president, preaches about building a movement of millions. And he's absolutely right. But that movement has to have political expression, independent of the corporations and Wall Street. We need a party. I don't know, are we live? I don't.
No, Mark.
I was in a meeting with.
Mark, I have to cut us off.
Cut us off. I'm done. I can't tell you my Nancy. I can't tell you my Nancy Pelosi story.
No,
I've been cut off. Out of time. You got us on a roll.
You can tell it outside. Not on the camera. He didn't say that. Joseph.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on a point brother made about, look, the 2016 elections, it was fundamentally an election about economics. And Donald Trump spoke the language. He spoke the words that people wanted to hear, right? Donald Trump said, right, every decision that I make as president is going to deliver more jobs, better wages. I'm going to punish corporate offshores. We're going to bring back jobs to America. It was a bait and switch, right? We all know that, but people in pivot counties, people in battleground states, in Ohio, in Michigan, they were desperate. They feel forgotten by both political parties. They feel forgotten by bad trade deals, right, sold out by Wall Street. And they were so desperate, right, they voted for Donald Trump. But there was an alternative, right? The other candidate who was on the front lines championing the cause of workers was Senator Sanders. And I want to do a particular shout out because nobody else over the course of the Fight for 15 in Washington, D.C., Good Jobs Nation, we did 20-plus strikes. It was Senator Sanders, it was Keith Ellison, and it was other members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus who led that movement, who stood up to the centrist Democrats who actually didn't support the Fight for 15 in the union and said this is the right thing to do. Right? That's the battle, right, that we've got to engage because Trump is, you know, we spent a lot of time, I went to probably about a dozen Trump rallies with laid off manufacturing workers this summer ahead of the midterms, right? These are the workers that Trump betrayed. He went and said, I'm going to save your jobs. Well, GM Lordstown, thousands of workers are on the streets as of this week. Those workers are angry, right? And they understand that Donald Trump is not going to be, right, the champion that he promised he's going to be. And that's why I think as we move into this next moment, we don't need more centrism. We don't need more half-baked economic ideas, right? We need full-throated economic populism. We need to make sure that we grow the American labor movement. We need to make sure that we have candidates like Senator Sanders who stand on the side of workers and struggle, because that will make all the difference between winning or losing in 2020 and whether we realize the progressive vision that we all want for health care for all, for a green climate, et cetera.
Thank you, Joseph. Mark. Now, Peter, once again, I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask all of you to stand up, and we're going to sing together. And Peter's going to lead us in song again, right? Yes?
That means we're done?
That means we're done.
That means we're
No,
done.
we're not done. We're just beginning.
We're just beginning. We're just beginning. So same song, right? Same song. It's not that I'm a one-tongue pony, although I can be. So, when the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet no force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one, for the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. Thank you.
Love these guys. Thank you all. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.